Okay, I think we're going to go get started. Hello and welcome, everyone. My name is Priya Jain, and I'm the Secretary and Board Member of the Historic Preservation Education Foundation. I'm also an Associate Professor at Texas A&M University. Today, we are going to hopefully give you guys a little bit more introduction about the Historic Preservation Education Foundation, as well as one of its signature programs, the Partners in Documentation grant program. So to get started, actually before we get started, we will have a format in which we have two speakers that I'll introduce in a bit, and they have presentations to share with you. If you have questions along the way, please type them up using the Q&A button that you see at the bottom of your Zoom window. After our speakers have finished their presentations, we will take up your questions. And hopefully we'll have a lot of time for questions and answers. So yes, feel free to input any questions that you have along the way using that Q&A feature in Zoom. Okay, so let's get started. Our first speaker today is going to be Lauren Drapala. Lauren is the Director of Programs at the Historic Preservation Education Foundation. In her role, she oversees the organization's key programs, which include Partners in Training, Partners in Documentation, Preserving the Recent Past Conference Series, and others. She is currently pursuing her PhD in Design History at Bard Graduate Center and serves as a lecturer in the Boston Architectural College's Historic Preservation Graduate Program. She has over a decade of experience working as a preservation consultant and architectural conservator, having held positions at Building Conservation Associates, DBVW Architects, Historic House Trust of New York City, and the Fairmount Park Conservancy. Welcome, Lauren.
Thank you so much, Priya. I just wanted to start by giving a little bit of a background on Historic Preservation Education Foundation. Our organization was founded in 1986 in support of early efforts by the National Park Service to expand resources for the public and for the trades community. So we began our history in conferences, and that's something that is really essential to our mission, is creating public forums to share the latest information for the general public and also for practitioners working within the preservation field. So currently the way that we do this is through three main initiatives. We have our grant making programs, which include Partners in Training, which we had an earlier session discussing, and the focus of tonight's event, Partners in Documentation. And more information is available on those programs on our website. Our second key strategy is providing education and advocacy for the communities we share. So we do this through convening national conferences. I recognize many of the names here from your participation in the Preserving the Recent Past Forward conference that we held last year in Boston. So it's great to see many of you again. And so we do this through holding conferences as well as advancing advocacy, providing resources and best practices in the cultural heritage field. And again, there are a lot of resources on our website that you can check out related to those programs. Lastly, we are a provider of AIA continuing education credit, and we offer a free programming series on our website through Preservation Brief Quiz system. So if you belong to the AIA or you need continuing education credits, please do make use of that resource. It's free, and it can help you when you're getting to the deadline of needing your credits. So that's something that we currently offer and hope to expand upon in the coming years. This will be the last event of our inaugural program series. So if you were able to join us for previous programs, thank you so much for your support. If you weren't and you would love to catch up, we have recordings of all of our events on our website that you can access through our Vimeo channels or through YouTube. And this brings us to the focus of our conversation tonight. So before we introduce Jonathan and hear the fantastic work that happened at the Miller House, I wanted to give you a little bit of a background of the Partners in Documentation grant program that helped support a component of that work. So Partners in Documentation was set up out of a series of programs that took place starting in 2013 that helped provide learning opportunities for students to engage with under-recognized heritage through the documentation of historic structures and landscapes. And this was meant to be a program that really helps students engage with the systems of the National Park Service and the standards of generating measured drawings and photographs for preservation legacy projects. So the initiative was really meant to extend HPEF's success working with educational institutions, which is a really core part of our mission, particularly with program preservation-focused programs in the United States, and to increase student access to heritage documentation training. The second component of this project really came out of the Preserving the Recent Past initiative. The earliest projects that we funded and were involved with had to deal with these really landmark projects of modern architecture that had not been added to HABs. Because they fell within that strange recent past period where they hadn't fully been recognized by the preservation community. So this program set up particularly with a idea towards documenting recent past structures, as well as expanding that to all underrepresented examples that are currently within the HABS Hare Howells collection of Library of Congress. In order to apply, it must come from an institution that has a degree or certificate granting program focused on historic preservation within an institute of higher education. Geographically, it has to be located within the United States. The project itself has to be located within the United States by an institution based in the United States. The project has to conform to the documentation of National Park Service standards. So National Park Service has the heritage documentation programs that include Historic American Building Survey, as well as guidelines for landscape and engineering projects. So anything that falls within that realm is considered a feasible project within this grant. And lastly, and most importantly, there must be a student focus to these documentation projects. So any project that doesn't have student training as a primary objective will not be considered. The award ranges up to $6,000. Typically, it's right at that mark. And the eligible costs considered for this program it can't be used towards course development, staffing hours, construction costs, or administrative costs associated with generally running a program, but this funding is meant to cover anything within the gap of what might make a project less feasible for a program. So particularly for costs associated with student and instructor travel and accommodation for sites that might be inaccessible otherwise, any supply costs for drafting and photography supplies, if you have to hire a consultant in order to meet a certain part of the requirements. It's been used for internships. If post course you would like to hire a student in order to process the sort of tail end of a project, you can use the funding for that. Any equipment rentals, drawing reproduction and mailing costs, and limited food costs for extended site work. We accept applications on a biannual basis, so there's always a submission deadline in December 1st, and our upcoming one is for June 1st, so you can always rely on that. I just wanted to highlight our kind of origin project. The first time HPEF really got involved with this level of documentation project was at the Charles and Ray Eames House in Pacific Palisades, California. This was a collaboration with the University of Southern California, the Eames Foundation, and the Getty Conservation Institute. And so students had the opportunity to conduct measured drawings of this house. And if you can believe it, this was not part of HABS in 2013. This major landmark of architecture. And so the project produced 13 measured drawings and a detailed historical outline that are now part of the Library of Congress. Similarly, HPEF got involved with the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign School of Architecture and the Schweiker House Preservation Trust to prepare drawings and other historic documentation. This was a seminar course that involved 2 site visits in which students prepared field notes, photographs, measured drawings of the structure's facades, and they submitted a massive delivery to the HAPS program that's now included as part of the Library of Congress's permanent collection. I just wanted to go over, it's a fairly simple application process. There's a form available through HPEF's website that asks for a pretty basic outline of what you have proposed for the course. We request resumes of the initiation chair and any key participants, preliminary schedule of how long you think your project will take, letters of intent from the primary applicant and any partners that are involved with the project, and a budget, which would include all of the project costs associated with your project, but particularly how the PIDU funds would be applied and any additional support you're receiving from other grant funding organizations. To give you a sense for this upcoming deadline of June 1st, we expect to respond with the application decision within 6 weeks of the submission deadline. So by July 15th, you'll know. And you have generally about 2 years to complete that project. So if you are selected, we will go through arranging an agreement letter. We can if there's any need to change that completion date, we can discuss it at that time. But this is generally the idea of how the program is set up, that within 2 years of your submission, that the project would be completed. Previously awarded projects include a wide range. I just wanted to include it here to give you a sense of geographically, this is happening all over the country. We have some examples of modern architecture, the way that these previous examples showed, but many of them also deal with cultural communities that have often been overlooked. So we have Priya, actually, that's joining this discussion, is heading the Sri Minashi Temple in Houston, Texas, which, if you're not familiar with this building, it's incredible. And we have the Aminate Methodist Church. I believe that Lisa is on the webinar as well, that has been heading that project, Appalachian community. There's the Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture. And this it shows the diversity of the programs that we're interested in trying to fund through this program. And with that all said, we would like to get to one of our stellar examples of a fantastic collaboration and research project. And I'll hand things over to Priya to introduce Jonathan Spodek.
Thank you, Lauren, for that wonderful intro. And yes, I'm very excited to introduce Jonathan next. Jonathan Spodek is a professor of architecture at Ball State University in Muncie, Indiana, a fellow of the American Institute of Architects. Professor Spodek is nationally recognized for his leadership that bridges the values of historic preservation, sustainability, community engagement, and architecture. He teaches design studios and courses in building technology that include building documentation, historic building construction materials and techniques, and evaluation and diagnostic methods. In 2023, Professor Spodek received a Partners in Documentation grant from HPEF for his project to document the Miller House in Columbus, Indiana. Next, he will be sharing insights from this project with us today. Welcome, Jonathan.
Well, thank you, Priya, and thank you everyone for joining us. It's exciting to see such an interest in both the program and this project. If we could go on to the next slide, please. So just a little bit of background about the Miller House. Many of you may already be aware of it, um, but it's considered one of the preeminent modernist homes of the 20th century, and it's located in Columbus, Indiana, about an hour south of Indianapolis. And as you also may know, that Columbus, Indiana has a reputation for its modernist and contemporary architecture, largely due to the Miller family. Under Mr. Miller's leadership, Cummins Engines grew from a small local company to a multinational leader in diesel engines, and with that grew a great amount of wealth. Mr. Miller also had a fondness for contemporary design and brought Eliel Saarinen, Eero Saarinen's father, to Columbus in the 1940s to design the first Christian church, which is also a National Historic Landmark. But by the 1950s, the Miller family had established a foundation to promote contemporary architecture in Columbus. Mr. Miller commissioned Eero Saarinen to design three very important landmarks in Columbus. First was the Irwin Bank, the Irwin family, which is also one of Mr. Miller's family businesses in downtown Columbus. He then had Eero Saarinen work on his home, the Miller House, and finally on North Christian Church. And North Christian Church was actually completed after his death by Kevin Roche and John Dinkeloo. Then in 2000, it's interesting because the Miller House becomes the first National Historic Landmark to receive the designation while one of its designers, landscape architect Dan Kiley, was still living, and while the building was still occupied by its original owners. What happened is once the Mrs. Miller passed in 2008, the estate was donated to Indianapolis Museum of Art, which is currently known as Newfields. And though many of the prominent works of art, such as a Henry Moore statue in the garden and a Matisse painting, were not included, the majority of interior furnishings and fixtures were. If we could go to the next slide, please. So the house showcases some of the prominent designers of the 20th century. Of course, most well-known is Eero Saarinen, but also architect Kevin Roche, who was Eero Saarinen's chief design associate and ultimately took over the firm when Saarinen passed away, has a heavy hand in the design. Alexander Gerard, a very well-known New York-based interior designer. And then Dan Kiley, who did a lot of work with Saarinen, was the landscape architect. And if you know the house at all, you'll notice that the landscape and the house are intricately related in one to another. So if we could go to the next slide. So I'm going to talk a little bit about how we approach this from a curricular standpoint and how we try to integrate documentation and why we integrate documentation into our curriculum. We have students participating in this program that are in their Master of Science in Historic Preservation graduate program. We also have students who are a dual masters doing architecture, Master of Architecture, Master of Science in Historic Preservation. We have students who are either Master of Architecture or Master of Urban Design and doing a graduate certificate in historic preservation. And so with that, we're able to bring a lot of different perspectives. We integrate every year a documentation project into 3 courses. The first is our documentation studio, which focuses on sort of theory and approach to documenting historic sites in a variety of fashions, both traditional as well as sort of emerging technologies. We have a research methods class that happens parallel to that, and we often integrate ideas and ways of doing both archival research as well as other type of ethnographic research on the subject building. And then in the spring, we take that foundation of documentation and use it in our preservation technology course that focuses on materials and assessments. And so it's nice to students are able to follow a project from first learning about it, researching it, documenting it, and understanding the physical fabric of it by the end of the year. If you could go to the next, please. So the approach we take through this is what we call the four lenses of documentation. And the idea is to approach documentation not simply as a means to learn techniques to prepare a set of measured drawings or to prepare a set of documents, but really as a way to understand sort of a theoretical basis and a programmatic basis for why we're doing what we do. So the first one we talk about is through the lens of an ethnographer, and you'll see that in some of the examples of how we take field data and notes. The idea of immersive observation and measurements to create what's known as thick descriptions, going beyond just surface level observation as an effort to explain different layers of historic contexts. The idea is that students can gain insights into the social and cultural frameworks that also shape our built environment. We then talk about looking at documentation through the lens of an architect. One that I think is often the most obvious because the product of a lot of the documentation is architectural style drawings. And in this, it requires students to take evaluative judgments on what and to document and how to document in order to convey an understanding of context to the historic site. It's an understanding of construction methods. It's idea of developing technical proficiencies for analysis, and also looking at different means of representation. The third lens we look is through the lens of a conservator, with the idea of documenting detail and accurate records necessary for the stewardship and restoration and maintenance of these historic sites, because we have an understanding that the basis of any future stewardship, any intervention, is going to be documentation. And the last one is through a lens of what we call an observer. It's the idea of being able to observe the building, trying to understand why it was made, how it was made, for whom it was made, understand changes over time, and sort of understand the fabric against the relationship of the built environment, whether that be through broader trends or through something that's sort of a unique anomaly. But also within that observer is how and what do we communicate, and what's the best means and methods to communicate. If we could go to the next slide. Thank you. The goals of this particular project actually came from Newfields as we sort of began the discussion. And the conversations for this started actually a couple years prior to our successful grant application. In 2021, a conservation management plan was completed for Newfields. And during that process, they realized that they had no documentation of what the building existed like today. There was the original construction drawings from the 1950s, but there was nothing that documented change over time and the changes that the Miller family made throughout their lifetime, which is an interesting phenomenon to understand that this was a building that for over 50 years was lived in by the family as their primary residence. Also looking at documentation as a bait for future funding and grants, raising funds, and just sort of to aid in the conservation of the building. We looked at in terms of sort of stewardship and management. There's a comprehensive database of the collections of items in the house, but that was limited to collections management, and through conversations, realizing that the biggest object in their collection is actually the building. And so thinking of, in this case, the building as a piece of that's part of that collection was a new perspective that Newfields really hadn't thought about that. So we look at from a collection management strategy. And the other thing is just monitoring. After almost 75 years, the building needed conservation. Things had moved, things had shifted, things were deteriorating. And so to be able to record conditions and monitor them, and then over time to be able to go back to that. The example we use is the terrazzo plinth, or that terrazzo patio immediately surrounding the building had a lot of both localized damage, cracking, failed substrate. And so we can look at how that shifted and changed, worsens or doesn't over time, and to help them prioritize what work needs to be done. So if we could move to the next, please. So when we think about data collection, we think about it not just from the teaching technology. We have a lot of conversations about all the various methods that are available, but for us, we always start with traditional hand measuring, sketching, drawing, and measuring. And it goes back to that idea of being an ethnographer. And the idea of the primary way ethnographers gather data is through observation. And we take that same methodology and apply it to a physical building. So the vast majority of data we collect, I think we had about 65 sheets of hand-done field notes when the project was finished. We do bring in some technology, but we do it as a secondary source to supplement the hand drawing. So our field data is really about teaching the students values and judgment, to be able to understand a place, to be able to understand what is important about that place, and try to understand the physical fabric that makes up that place. One of the big advantages that we did have is we did have access to the 1955 set of construction drawings. And for the most part, these were absolutely invaluable. We couldn't have completed what we did in the time frame we did without them. But we also understood that they were incomplete, and that there had been modifications over time. And so we used that as a foundation for getting started, but always went back to verify what was going on. To give you an example of some of the changes that we had over time, one of the most noteworthy changes actually happened during construction. In the upper left-hand quadrant of the floor plan, you'll see the children's bedroom suite. And at the time, they had 3 girls and a boy. But when they began construction, Mrs. Miller found out she was pregnant with what would be their 5th child, another boy. So that suite had to be redesigned. And then ultimately, when the children grew and left, there were some modifications to turn one of the children's bedroom into Mrs. Miller's office. There was also changes made in their own personal bedroom suite, which you'll notice on the upper right-hand corner, where as the Millers aged, they redesigned the bathroom to accommodate some needs they had for mobility. There was what's known now as the guest room, had originally been multiple spaces. It had been a maid's bedroom as well as a guest bedroom. And that had been opened up into a single guest bedroom and modified. There's the kitchen, which changed over time, both as it modernized, but also as their family needs changed. That became where they had the majority of their family meals, and the main dining room was just used for guests and hosting guests. And then there's the very famous display wall that is in the main public space. And that had been modified multiple times as different objects needed to be displayed. There's a whole area that became a TV room as the modern TV technologies in there. Mr. Miller bought a Stradivarius violin and had it modified so that it would have a place to hold his violin. And over time, just changes that happen throughout. So we often look at it through the lens of an architect, and through that lens, we tend to do traditional architectural drawings. But what these drawings are, they're not a representation of how somebody experiences the place or space, and it's not a representation that somebody without a trained eye can look at. But we do the traditional floor plans, elevations, sections, and what those drawings start to tell us is about floor plans start to tell us about relationships of space. They start to tell stories about how the place is used. And through the selection of which drawings that we decide to do, we can start to prioritize what's important about the building. We could have gone on, I think we ended up with about 20 sheets of drawings, and we could have easily, if we had the time and inclination, doubled that. But ultimately had to make decisions, value decisions on what to include and what not to include. So we decided on certain key details, the very prominent and famous conversation pit that had been modified in a number of ways over the years, or something as simple as the sideboard in the dining room. We also started to look at all the details of how the pieces and parts of the building come together. I think once you get into the documentation process, you realize how exquisitely detailed this building is. Everything was thought through, every relationship of materials, of the aluminum glass framing, of the slate panels on the exterior walls, to the terrazzo pattern on the floor, to the integration of the skylights and how the grid of skylights intersects different spaces, both interior and exterior. And so having to decide how and to what extent the details becomes part of that understanding as an observer, as an architect, and as an ethnographer. We're also able to track down some of the original materials through the specs and look at some of the product manuals that help us sort of better understand what the building is built of. In the 1950s, one of the early examples of using double glazed glass in the windows, which was at the time relatively unheard of. The other thing we look at is what's not in the archival drawing. So we do have quite a lot of drawings from the original construction, and a lot of those original drawings match to what was built and what still exists today. But there's other elements of the building that we focus on. For example, the fireplace, the iconic cylindrical fireplace in the public space. You can see on the left the original design. There was actually a few other designs that happened along the way. And ultimately, we found out through Ben Weaver, who is the current caretaker and was worked for Mr. and Mrs. Miller since he was a teenager, that actually Kevin Roche designed that fireplace on a napkin, sort of that iconic napkin sketch that an architect might do. And then worked with a local craft person to create the basket in the hearth, and then worked with the other craftspeople to sort of finalize the detail on how it fits in. And so we were able to identify where those gaps were and try to fill in so that there was some documentation of what was done. Another thing which was really important to Newfields and to the managers of the building was trying to confirm construction details that were hidden. So we looked at the original construction documents, and then we're able to get up and into some of the plenums. I guess for good or bad, some of the panels for the skylights were broken. So we were able to get good views and get sort of both remote sensing measurements as well as what we could get in there. And so we were able to confirm how things were built, whether they were built as they were originally drawn or specified, and where changes have been made. And this is some more examples of those skylights that we were actually able to get up and into, which really is, I guess, a treat because some of the glass panels had been broken. The reason they hadn't been fixed is they can't find a match from the 1950s glass. So perhaps you have somebody on the meeting this evening has a great source. So some of the key considerations that we went through and that I would recommend as we sort of think through what and how to document is thinking about all methods of field data collection for buildings of this era or this specific era. I know in the professional world, we probably wouldn't spend as much time hand measuring or hand sketching or hand drawing, but maybe using more digital scanning, things that are a little bit more efficient. But as a pedagogical approach, I think the digital documentation lacks as students tend to get more involved in the actual technique of using the software and the hardware to collect the data than they do to understand the reasons why and how and the place that they're documenting. If there are some archival drawings that are available, and this is one of the blessings we often have on more contemporary sites to document, it's a great starting point, but we also have to remember that it's just a starting point, and we still need to go through the thorough investigation as we would if those drawings didn't exist. So often how it was built is as important as what was built. And this is where we may differ, and maybe some of the approaches to the HABs is from our perspective, we want the students to understand the materials that are going on, the techniques, the assemblies. And that's going to be true whether it's a 20th century heritage site or whether it's an 18th century or even earlier. We approach the overall drawings as we would any drawing, but the question becomes, how do you record the details? Every project's probably going to have floor plans and building elevations and all the traditional orthogonal drawings, architectural drawings. But I think where it really becomes interesting is what details that you decide to record and what does that tell you about the building and what can it inform not just the archival collection but also how you understand the site. And we do a lot with interviews. We interview people who are there. We interview people who are aware of what's going on. We think that the oral histories that revolve around many of the historic sites have as much value as the physical documents. So we'd make a lot of effort to talk to people and don't limit it just to those who we think know, because often some of the most interesting stories happen from the people who are just involved peripherally. And just to let you know, our hope is to actually document the Dan Kiley landscape through a Howells set of drawings, because Dan Kiley was an extraordinary landscape architect. His long-term relation with Eero Saarinen is well documented. And this building in itself sort of expresses that relationship that Dan Kiley's design and Eero Saarinen's design they were really done together. And the house cannot exist without the site, and the site cannot exist without the house. So hopefully we'll be able to get that done in the near future. I just wanted to mention, we're very fortunate in our curriculum. We have a class dedicated to documentation every fall semester, and we pick different buildings to do that. And we work really closely with the staff at the Historic American Building Survey. They're great about reaching out. I think often universities and schools and students get a little bit intimidated by the level of some of the drawings or whether they'll be able to adequately meet the standards. And I think with a little bit of guidance, if you've not done this before, it's really quite accessible. The staff, Mark Shara in particular, is great about talking to the students, about doing many training sessions with them, about reviewing their drawings at intermediate stages, and sort of being part of that throughout the process, from selecting a historic site all the way through to when the drawings are submitted. I know that Lauren mentioned photography. We actually don't do photography in our program, nor did we do it on the Miller House. But to submit to the Historic American Building Survey, it does not require photography. They primarily are looking for the architectural style drawings, but also encourage you to do written histories as well. If you can get the large format photography, that's just icing on the cake. But we know that that's really expensive, and to get the people experience to do that is often very difficult. So I'd just like to thank you for coming. I'd love to, these are some of our students that worked on the project out in front of the reflecting pool on the west side of the building of the Miller House. So I'd be happy to answer questions about this project, as I'm sure Lauren will, about the program. And I hope that you guys will all consider doing a submission and getting your schools involved in documentation.
Okay. Great. Thank you. Thank you, Jonathan. And yes, great, wonderful. You guys have your videos on now. So I don't see any questions in the chat yet, but feel free to add them. But I think I have some questions, so I'm happy to get us started. I think my first question, Jonathan, is for you. First of all, wonderful project, and it's so great to see, the city, the school, and the students all involved in kind of making a difference. So thank you for all the work that your program has been doing in documenting these buildings through the years. I guess my question is, since you guys do these projects kind of regularly, I think starting with the Miller House, but in general, how do you pick the projects? Are these new nonprofits that are approaching you? Are you guys thinking what's out there? What could we be looking at?
It really varies. So with the Miller House, we have a long relationship with Newfields. They have a second historic site called Old Fields, which was the Josiah Lilly estate. Josiah Lilly is the grandson of Eli Lilly from Lilly Pharmaceuticals. And it was originally a 26-acre site that when Josiah Lilly and his wife passed, they left again to the Indianapolis Arts Council, and that became the home of the Indianapolis Art Museum. But the other half of the property is his estate, and we've done different projects over the years through them. And truthfully, that relationship grew because we started talking at our statewide historic preservation conference, and it sounded like fun. It sounded like a great opportunity for our students. And it's only an hour away. Columbus was a little bit more difficult. It's several hours from where our university is located in Indianapolis. And that's where something like the Partners in Documentation program, they were able to fund us going and spending 4 days on site. to work on the project and bring us all down there for that time. So the other times we will work with local government. So we have a project right now with the in Hamilton County, Indiana, with the local Parks District, who just acquired an 1827 farmhouse and didn't even know where to start. And they gave us a call, again, through relationship. We've worked with different not-for-profits over the years. We've worked with some Indiana Landmarks, which is our statewide preservation not-for-profit, as well as some local historical societies who have projects. So we're basically out there. The program's been around since 1979. So at least in Indiana, and we've done some projects in Ohio, people are aware that we exist, and so they often just reach out to us. Every now and then we'll see a project and we'll say, we need to get our students involved. That would be a great historic site for this sequence of classes. But I would say that's probably the exception.
That's great. Thank you, Jonathan. We do have some wonderful questions in the chat. So maybe I'll start with Devin Coleman's questions first. And Lauren, I think you're the best person to answer this, but it asks for historic preservation programs not affiliated with the School of Architecture. How feasible is it to undertake a documentation project like this? I think I would also add, would HPEF be open to considering a grant proposal from a non-school or non-academic program?
Okay. Well, Devin, that's a really fantastic question. And I think with documentation projects in particular, this feasibility question is really important. I mean, Jonathan, I like that you highlighted, you could have made a drawing set that was twice as big as what you did, but you have to be realistic about kind of the scope of a project and how much you can do within the time allotted. And so we've seen a number of different ways that this is done, but I would say most preservation programs are not that we've granted to don't necessarily have architects built into their documentation project. Some of them are within schools of architecture, but I think most of the students doing documentation work, it's a mix, right? So I think the ways that I've seen this done in the way that they've been organized in our submissions is that if you know that there's going to be a steep learning curve with the students that you're working with, you generally tend to build in some training of a student that you know has the capability, maybe that has done drafting before, that can kind of take the lead after the course is done to prepare a submission set. So you can use the course as a way to teach field documentation, some techniques, but with the understanding that there's going to be a lot of kind of post-course cleanup and things to develop the set. Priya, you had mentioned about courses that fall outside of academic institutions.
Yeah, I mean, my question was, is PID, because our focus at HPEF is so squarely on kind of academic and student involvement. I think Devin's question was a little bit different, which I know you answered, that for preservation programs, the students who don't have architectural skills and drawing skills might need a learning curve. But I think what Jonathan said, perhaps working with the National Park Service, making sure that, you kind of have that constant dialogue. And I also should point out there are different levels of documentation, right? Jonathan, perhaps you could talk about that there could be maybe like a light level, maybe as an initial submission.
Yeah. So the Miller House is sort of, it's probably the biggest set that we've done that I can recall. Most of our projects are much smaller. We have done projects that have been a single sheet of drawings. We've had projects that most of them are probably in the 5 to 8 sheets of drawings. And we also have students, not all of these students have architectural backgrounds. I think I'm trying to remember on the Miller House, it was about 1/3. We ended up with about 12 students total getting involved in the various pieces of that project. And only about 4 of them, maybe 5, had architectural backgrounds. The rest came from anthropology, public history, history. We had one person who had a non-traditional, who came out of like biology or one of the hard sciences. Um, so one of the things we do is we have little training sessions at the beginning of each phase of the project, and those are strictly focused on techniques. So a lot of them have never drawn a floor plan, have never drawn a building elevation. So we take that time within that class to do that. Now it's a studio course, so we have a little bit more time than we would say in a 3-credit seminar course. But I know the Park Service has another competition that's not the Peterson Prize, that's just for a single sheet of drawings. And students have been really successful at different universities around the country doing that. So, and I also think that the Park Service is more interested in getting documentation is their priority. And as long as it has some basic fundamental skills to it, they're willing to accept it. Not every project's gonna be, the top-notch examples. And so I think if you look at the Park Service's manuals, they're really great training guides that you can download from their HABS website. By working with the staff there, I don't know if they have the money at this point to do in person, but certainly doing virtual training sessions with the students. They will more than happy to look over your field notes, to make recommendations and suggestions. We've sent them preliminary drawings and they've marked them up and said, here's our recommendations. So I would really encourage any academic program, whether there's architects or not, to start by reaching out to the Park Service, to the HABS teams, and just start that conversation and ask them, how do we get started? Or reach out to somebody who you know at another university. I'd be happy to talk with somebody in another venue about how do we even get this started. But our project we're doing this year is that 1827's building. If I recall correctly, we had 9 people in that class in the fall. Only 2 of them had architectural backgrounds. The rest had never even sketched before.
Yeah, I think that's helpful. And I just want to add that the Park Service also has excellent guides. There is an excellent guide to field documentation that can be shared with students as a way to jumpstart the class. Lauren, do you want to add something?
Oh, I wanted to reiterate something that Jonathan said about I think part of this is also designing the project that best fits with your skill set and program. There is not a minimal submission that you have to do. Some projects lean more heavily on the written narrative versus the measured drawings. And so we're very open here in terms of the grant for whatever makes the most sense for your program. But the main idea is that we want to help support this method of documentation. We want students to have access to all the resources that the National Park Service and the Heritage Documentation Program has set up for this kind of learning experience. And that can be as big or small as makes sense for your program or for the site.
I think that's a great point. And just to add that, yes, the HABS documentation program includes the history narrative, the drawings, and photographs. And if I remember, we recently got an application, I think in our previous cycle, from a program that was very focused on architectural photography. So
exactly,
what they were going to do was only the photographs. So yes, you can kind of, based on the skills of the students and the program focus, it could be either one of those 3 things. There is another wonderful question in the question and answer from Priyanka Panjwani, and it's for Jonathan. And she asks, what is the methodology envisioned to document the Dan Kiley landscape for the Miller House?
Oh, wow. What a great question. And we've given this a lot of thought. One of the biggest challenges of documenting landscapes is as soon as they're in the ground, particularly the plants, they change. They're constantly in change, and I think that's the case. So there's two levels that we want to focus on. The first is the the design landscape immediately around the house itself, because a lot of that is hardscapes. A lot of that is very specific patio. There was a lot of outdoor entertaining space. There's sort of a hidden area that was originally designed to dry the clothes on the line that most people don't see. There's architectural features that come out quite a ways from the house that brought fresh air into the heating cooling system. There's a swimming pool that was added a number of years after the building was completed for the Millers. So there's that immediate thing, which is would follow a lot of the more traditional architectural techniques that we would do on a building. But the whole site is about 20 acres. And it starts from the road on the west side, and it goes down, and there's a huge drop that goes down to the river. All of that was designed by Kylie, and in fact, a lot of it has changed. There was some arbors that none of the original trees are there. They've all been replaced, and they were replaced with different species. There's if anybody's been to the house in Columbus, Indiana, along the road, there's a massive hedgerow which acts as a giant, like 15-foot tall wall that was originally, it's the original plants. They just weren't tended to. And it was originally meant to be a low hedge because this was out at the very, very far edges of town. But as the town grew, they let them grow up. So how do you interpret that? What was the original design intent? As far as the specific methodology and techniques, a lot of it, we use a lot of survey methods. So we'll actually be out there with a theodolite to try to get both contours and changes of grade because there's quite a change. Part of the site is actually in a floodplain along the river, the Red River, and the other. And then also locating all the different both architectural design features as well as plants and doing identification. So what we envision is a series of giant site plans, that start at a 20-acre level and then sort of break down into smaller site plans and probably some sections from the road all the way to the river to show about how that grade changes over time. Planting plans of what is there today. They do have the original Kylie drawing, so they know what the original design intent was. And then probably more architectural style drawings for the features that are immediately around the building.
Great. Thank you, Jonathan. That sounds very exciting. I have a quick question, and I want to get to the third one, but real quick. So is this going to be a HAL submission, or will this be an addenda to the HABS one that you've already done?
It will be drawn to HAL's standards, but I'll be honest, typically how they designate, it will probably be a subset of the HABS set. So typically that's just how they designate numbers, but we'll be drawing them to the HALS, the Historic American Landscape Survey standards.
And just
if we get it funded.
Yes, no, absolutely. And that's what I wanted to say, that HPEF doesn't discriminate between HALS or HAIR. So if there are people who here, who are engineering schools, want to do a HAIR documentation, which is the Historic American Engineering Record, or landscape programs, then yes, absolutely. Just standalone HALS HAIR grant requests are also very, very welcome. We have one more question from Andrea, and she's asking, how many hours of access to the site have you needed through each phase of the project per week?
So it really varies on the project, and the physical scale and the scope of what you're trying to achieve. I tell you with the um, the Miller House, it was a lot more than we typically do. So in that case, we were there in the first semester. So we had sort of two groups working on it. We had a group in the class working primarily on the interior, and then we had a group of graduate assistants primarily on the exterior. And so the graduate assistants would go down every other Friday. And that was actually funded externally from the HPEF grant. Um, and so they were down there every other Friday. So they'd get down there about 9 o'clock in the morning, 9, 10 o'clock, and then they'd leave about 3 or 4 in the afternoon. And having those original drawings was really important because we weren't having to create everything from scratch. We could sort of look at the drawings, look at the building. We could do a lot of work back in the studio to sort of set up our base documentation, go in and check it. As far as the class was, we were there once a month for a full day. So we would get there bright and early. We would leave it was about a 2 hour drive. We'd get there by about 8:30. And then we wouldn't leave until they closed up at about 5. And then we did do one period where we went down for 4 consecutive days. And so that was a pretty intensive documentation. And it just has to do with that the scale of it. It's a really big house. It's almost 5,000 square foot house. And the level of detail is enormous in that. And so we had the conversations, and Newfields also had certain objectives that they wanted to make sure that we achieved. Some of the smaller projects that we have, like the project we're doing this year, as far as the documentation, we'll have usually 3 one-day visits a semester. So we'll go down, well, we'll have a first one which we just go out to familiarize the students with the project, just so they can understand what's going on, be there, observe, start to get some ideas. Then we spend a lot of time in the research mode trying to understand what it is we're looking at. We'll have a day of preparing our base documents. We'll have a day of usually 2 days of measurements. We'll typically focus one day on the exterior of the building, one day on the interior, and we break into teams. So we'll have teams of 3 or 4 students, depending on the class size, to do that. And so we'll have 3 of those, and then we'll start the actual drawings. And then if you've ever done these projects, you know there's always something you missed, or you're looking at your notes and you can't quite figure out what you're trying to say in your documents. So we'll usually have one towards the latter end as we're getting close, where we go back one more time and try to get information that we need that we didn't have, or reconfirm something. So typically 4 days on site. And that's why we try to keep it within an hour of our university, where the Miller House was kind of unique in that sense. But I guarantee you no student complained. They were absolutely ecstatic to be able to crawl around every piece and part in the building of that building. They all fought over who got to document the conversation pit, because everyone wanted to get down. They would only let 2 people down into the conversation pit.
Thank you, Jonathan. I think, and finally, it would also depend on the technique that you're using, right? If you're using the 3D laser scanning versus hand measurements, that might have
and it's a pedagogical decision. We do not use laser scanning in our documentation studio, because that's not our goal of what we're trying to teach our students, particularly students who are not coming with a technical or architectural background. we're trying to teach them how to look at a building, how to understand the materials, start to look at how the building was constructed in different phases, trying to identify differences and similarities, understanding the materiality. And my experience with laser scanning is that it's so much focused on data collection that they don't pay attention to where they are. Now, we do have other projects through our program that are outside of the context of our coursework that we do scanning, where they have very specific objectives, and we do laser scanning, photogrammetry, and structured light scanning as part of our toolbox, but not in the context of doing our HABS projects.
Thank you. I don't see any other questions in the chat. So if anybody has a burning question, now is the time to type it in. Otherwise, I think Lauren has mentioned that our upcoming grant deadline for applications is June 1st. So look out for that. And in the meantime, if you have any questions, yes, please, reach out to HPEF and Lauren, and the information is on the website. Anything else, Lauren, that you want to end with?
No, that's it. And any level of inquiry is great. I'm happy to talk with anyone that's considering how they can make this work for their programs, and we're here to help partner.
Okay, with that, I guess I want to thank Jonathan for sharing this wonderful project and this process with all of us. I think it was very helpful. And thank you, Lauren, as well, and to everybody who was here to join us.
Thank you, everyone.
Evening, everyone.
Thank you, Jonathan.
Thanks.